tonight's the last night of our series on Mary. And so tonight we're going to talk about Mary as the sorrowful mother. So you may have heard of her by that title before. It's a pretty popular one. And here up on the screen, we have an image of, Mary at the foot of her son's cross. It's a very powerful, famous image. She's there with others that had gathered around to mourn Jesus, but also specifically with John, the beloved disciple. And so that's kind of going to be our visual focus for tonight, is this image of Mary as the sorrowful mother at the foot of her son's cross. Because right now, the church itself is suffering, and the bride is, in a sense, in pain, missing, her spouse. We're disconnected in a very real way from Jesus. And I was writing a reflection for a friend of mine who's also a youth minister, Becca. She came to the bonfire last fall, which seems like 3 million years ago. And I was writing about my experience of 10 years of being Catholic tomorrow. Yay. And I was reflecting on just how tough it is to round out 10 years and to be separated from Jesus and not be able to receive him in the Eucharist, how that kind of reminds me in a little bit of a way what it felt like to be in RCIA, preparing to become Catholic, preparing to be received into full communion with the Holy Catholic Church. And we're all kind of on that journey together right now. We're waiting, we're anxiously hoping. It's not going to last forever, but it's tough. And we can't be around our friends. We've got all these inconvenient things that are in place in our lives. So we are, in a sense, suffering. Some of us in ways that are small, some of us in ways that are large. And so I thought it was appropriate to look into this tonight and close out our series on this. So we're going to talk about what Mary's taught me, at least over 10 years of being Catholic, about how a Christian should suffer. And we're going to look at what Jesus has to say about that, what his scripture has to say about that. And I'm also just going to share, and this is where like the small group time is going to be really cool, sharing, hopefully from our own lives. I'm going to share 3 women who just have really kind of exemplified a Marian approach to suffering for me. So if you all can just indulge me, because it'll be a little difficult. Myself and Megan are going to do the readings tonight. Megan, would you take this first reading for us from John's Gospel?
Sure. Standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of
Clopas,
and Mary of Magdala. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple there whom he loved, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home.
Thanks, Megan. So when I was, in the last 10 years of growing more in my Catholic faith, Mary was kind of a really, really difficult jump to make, because she was not someone I typically had thought of having a relationship with in the same way that I want to have a relationship with her son, Jesus. But as I've grown in that relationship, again, she's just taught me so much, and I've seen a Marian kind of perspective reflected in so many different people. And here at the foot of the cross, Mary shows us 3 unique aspects of suffering. She shows us the other people in the story. So there's the other Marys there. There's the beloved disciple. She shows us how to suffer with other people. She also shows us her own suffering, right there at the foot of the cross. Think about how sad it would be to lose a beloved teacher. Think about how sad it would be to lose your son. Think about how sad it would be, to lose your Lord, your master. Mary was losing all of those things and more. So she teaches us about her own suffering there. And then she also teaches us, because there at the foot of the cross, we've also obviously got Jesus hanging on the cross, suffering and dying for all of us too. So we see her unique perspective on Jesus's suffering. And as I go through some of the rest of this talk, I'm drawing from a talk I got to compile for some Xavier students a few years back. And through that, I discovered St. John Paul II, when he was Pope, he had an encyclical back in the 80s, I believe, called Salvifici Doloris. And it was an encyclical on Christian suffering. And he's got some beautiful things he draws out. So I'll actually do some reading for us from there. But let's start with the first type of suffering that Mary shows us. She shows us how to enter into suffering with other people. So what is her relationship to other people at the foot of the cross? She's not there to fix or come up with easy solutions. As we go through everything that we're seeing with all this coronavirus stuff, some people, I think, might believe that they have easy solutions. Some people, they hear that, oh, I'm disappointed I have to stay home or cancel my plans, and they want to offer what they see as maybe a simple solution of like, oh, well, there's other people suffering more in Italy. There's other people, out there on the streets and they're homeless. Mary doesn't do any of those things. The other people at the foot of the cross, she just enters into that suffering with them. I quote here from that encyclical, sometimes compassion remains the only or principal expression of our love and solidarity with the sufferer. That word compassion means to suffer with. And that's really all that Jesus is asking of his disciples, and that Mary does so well here. She doesn't, we don't hear her giving specific words of consolation to John. I'm sure that she did. We don't see her, breaking apart for people. Oh, don't be too sad. Like he's going to, he'll be back. Certainly this isn't the end. She just stops and resides in that suffering with them. And St. John Paul II goes on. We could say that suffering is present in order to unleash love in the human person, that unselfish gift of one's I on behalf of other people, especially those who suffer. John Paul II and Mary envision here a suffering where you are giving a gift of yourself. You're not trying to, erase that suffering in someone else, because ultimately, how could we? But you're just offering the gift of your presence and of yourself. And Mary's doing that par excellence here, which is really awesome. And that's why we see her as the perfect disciple of Jesus. And that's why we fly to this Virgin of Virgins, because in her, we see someone who is so radically willing to be there for other members of Christ's body. So Mary also teaches us how to suffer for ourselves. Mary is the first and best disciple, and she teaches us about what the lesson to take up your cross daily really means. So if you think about the image of the Sorrowful Mother, if you've ever seen one, and you might see, well, here, even with her Immaculate Heart, it's got the cross. I don't even know if you can see it, but it's got the cross stabbing through her heart, because she was known, much like her son was known as a man of constant sorrow, she was known as a woman of sorrows. Way back, there was an encounter in the temple early on in Jesus' life. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph go to the temple, and they meet Simeon, and he gives this prophecy. Behold, this child is destined for the rise and fall of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be contradicted. And you yourself, he's speaking to Mary here, a sword will pierce, so that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. Mary, many times over the Gospels, you'll see her take these moments where she stops and she ponders things in her heart. She has that intimate moment of self-reflection. She turns deep within, and she really experiences that suffering. Mary doesn't shy away from it. She accepts it willingly, because to be a disciple of Jesus means you have to be willing to pick up your cross and carry it, because that's what Jesus did. And to be a disciple is to take on the disciplines of your teacher, of your master. So if he did it, we have to do it. And Mary shows us how to pick up that cross and carry it along. And there's a great quote from Venerable Fulton Sheen's book, The Life of Christ, which is a beautiful, beautiful book. And he calls Mary's moment at the foot of the cross a second Annunciation even. So we talked a couple weeks ago about the Annunciation as Mary's, let it be done to me according to thy word moment, her yes to Jesus. At the foot of the cross, deep within her own suffering, she had to give that yes again, which I can't imagine how hard that would have been, and how gut-wrenching, how hard it would have been to give her yes, knowing what she knew with the first Annunciation, how much even harder it would have been to give that second yes there at the foot of the cross with her son dying in front of her for a people that didn't understand and wouldn't ultimately appreciate all that he's done. Finally, Mary shows us how to unite our sufferings with Christ. She shows us suffering as this path to a deeper union and intimacy with Jesus. Because again, if Jesus suffered, if Jesus had to pick up his cross and carry it, then it stands to reason that we as his disciples need to be willing to do that too. I quote again from St. John Paul II, down through the centuries and generations, it has been seen that in suffering, there is concealed a particular power that draws a person interiorly close to Christ, a special grace, a particular power in suffering that draws a person closer. St. John Paul II calls it a grace that brings us closer, lets us know more intimately the heart and the mind of Jesus. Without her son, Mary's suffering would have been just as intense, but it would have been without meaning. What I mean by that is, for the Christian person, we don't have to suffer the way that the world does, because our suffering, and this was the thing that blew my mind when I read this encyclical and was preparing this talk years ago, our suffering gets to have meaning through Jesus Christ, because in Jesus Christ, we can offer that suffering back. We can unite our suffering with his. And so our suffering takes on purpose. It's not just bad things happen to good people and that's how it is and it sucks. It's instead bad things happen. We're quarantined. We're isolated from each other. People are dying throughout the world. People are getting sick, and still within all of that, other bad stuff's going on because the world's broken. We don't have to suffer within that and be hopeless. We can take that suffering and we can unite it to the suffering of Jesus, and in that we can find meaning. So in just kind of applying this to our own lives, I wanted to just ask a couple of questions and provide a few answers and have just a little bit of scripture within that. So first of all, to back up, how can we suffer with other people as Mary did? Well, let's read the story of the Good Samaritan. And actually, you know what? I think Megan will agree with me. I'd love to hear someone else read this. So let me choose someone. Oh my gosh, and we've got Nick and Aiden joined us. That's nice. Hey Aiden, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Would you be willing to read that if you can see that on your screen?
Yeah, let me just get that.
That'd be awesome, man. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. But because he wished to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, 'Take care of him. If you spend more than what I've given you, I shall repay you on my way back.' Which of these 3, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim?" He answered, "The one who treated him with mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise."
Awesome. Thanks, Aiden. So again, I quote from St. John Paul II. We as Christians, and hear this, brothers and sisters, we're not allowed to pass by on the other side indifferently from people. We have to instead stop beside that other person. Everyone who stops beside the suffering of another person, whatever form it may take, is a good Samaritan. And the stopping, and I like that he makes this distinction, it doesn't mean you stop because you're curious. Stopping isn't a curiosity, it's an availability. So it's not rubbernecking, like when you see an accident on the highway and you're like, what the heck is that? And then you cause a million more accidents. It's instead a stopping because you want to be present with that person. Maybe you can offer some tangible help, but at the very least, offering a ministry of your presence. Compassion, again, that word that means suffering with someone else. We suffer with someone else just by being available, by being willing to be in a situation with other people, especially sometimes as people that we're not always jumping and champing at the bit to be available to. So the person in my life that showed me that much, that the most, and this is where I'm going to share about 3 awesome women in my life during the course of the rest of this talk. So for me, it was this woman, Alberta. And she was, when I was 1 year old, my mom decided she wanted to go back to work. And so they got a babysitter, just put out an ad. And this woman, Alberta, answered randomly. We didn't know her. And she ended up becoming essentially like a 3rd grandmother to me. She's very, very important. She died right before Megan and I got married, which was a huge bummer and letdown. But I didn't find out until much later in my life that Alberta was the only Catholic member of my family. And I put those in quotes, but she really was a member of our family. The only Catholic in a non-Catholic family. And it's also very odd because she's actually buried in Guardian Angel Cemetery, which is right in my backyard. She was just present and there with my family. I remember calling her up when my mom died. I remembered calling her up when when other bad stuff would happen, when, my brother Tyler had a lot of difficulties and troubles when he was growing up. I had to move back home out of college because of depression. She was just someone who was there and present. She didn't always have a magic way to fix things, but she was just there. She had that ministry of presence and availability. So she taught me like how to suffer with other people. So she's awesome. I'm glad that I can be so close to her. It's neat. And on the night that I was confirmed as a Catholic, her daughter, so she died at 92. Her daughter is younger than that. I don't know how old Eileen is. I don't want to out her age on the internet, but she gave me a blue rosary that was her mom's, and that became my rosary on the night I became Catholic, which was awesome. So next, how do we suffer well ourselves? So we're going to take a look at Matthew's gospel. So let me just click on us here. And can I get Nick, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Would you read this for me, bud?
Yeah.
Awesome, man. Thanks.
Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What profit would there be for one to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? Or what can one give in exchange for his life?"
Awesome. Thank you. So here's what St. John Paul II has to say about that. As a witness to her son's passion by her presence, and as a sharer in it by her compassion, Mary offered a unique contribution to what he calls the gospel of suffering by embodying in anticipation the expression of St. Paul, which was quoted, where St. Paul says that we're able to add up in our flesh to complete, in a sense, the suffering of Jesus Christ. Mary shows us that at the foot of the cross, because again, the passage that Nicholas read for us is that famous one of whoever wants to be my disciple has to deny themselves, has to be willing to take up their cross and follow me. You want to save your life, you're going to lose it anyway. You lose your life for my sake, you suffer for my sake, you add that suffering in, and you're going to find that life again. So the person in my life, and luckily she's walking away for a second, the person in my life who exemplifies that for me, just how to really feel your suffering, but to take that on intentionally, is Megan. Because 5 years ago when we found out that we wouldn't be able to have kids, it was really, really difficult. And I remembered we pulled aside in our car after we found out, and Megan just had a really, really good perspective, and she grounded me. It's one of the worst days of my entire life, one of the worst days of our life. But she had some great, great words of wisdom for me. And she was the one who really said, like, this stinks, this is awful, but God's going to do something with this. And I remembered her saying, because I just a month before started working at Guardian Angels as your youth minister, I remember her saying that it just made it that much more important. All the young people that we would get to meet, and yes, we'd figure out how to pick up our cross every day and suffer along with that. But because of that, we were going to be able to be more available to the students we'd minister to. So Megan just showed me that in a really cool way. So she's pretty awesome. So I offer her a high five off camera. There we go. All right. So the last one there, how do we unite that suffering? How do we answer that question? How do I unite my suffering with the suffering of Jesus? I have one more scripture passage prepared for us, and it's right here. How about for this one? I'd love my beautiful Megan to read this for me again, if you would. Let me just minimize some of this. All right, go for it, my dear.
After this, aware that everything was now finished, in order that the scripture might be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I thirst." There was a vessel filled with common wine. So they put a sponge soaked in wine on a spring of hyssop. and put it up to his mouth. When Jesus had taken the wine, he said, "It is finished." And bowing his head, he handed over the spirit.
So the really cool thing about that passage is a lot of different commentators have talked about that phrase, "I thirst." And one of my favorites is from this beautiful book, 33 Days to Morning Glory. Father Michael Gately, he reflects upon "I thirst" as being a driving force behind Mother Teresa's experience of, I need to go out and I need to serve the poor and vulnerable, as a way to meet the thirst of Jesus, which she felt revealed to her was Jesus's deep, desperate desire, his thirsting for souls, for the salvation of people, and for them to accept what he was doing for them on the cross. And Fulton Sheen, again, in that book, Life of Christ, he writes, but for the saved, Jesus' passion, his thirst was for the saved. It was a thirst, it was a yearning for souls. Some men have a passion for money, others for fame. His passion was souls. Give me drink meant give me your heart. The tragedy of divine love for mankind is that that in his thirst, men gave him vinegar and gall. When Jesus' thirst was for men's hearts, women's hearts, we gave him something less. So in suffering ourselves and seeking to unite that with Christ, it's literally just, Jesus, I give this back to you, because in you, you're going to do something with this suffering. And you won't just leave it as something awful that's happening to me. You can take it and transform it, and it can be something that's going to win souls for you, that's going to save someone, that's going to introduce someone to you. And my example for me in my life for this was my mom, who I've talked about a lot because she's one of my favorite people. These three ladies I've talked about tonight are three of my favorite people in the world. And you know, the whole time, and probably anyone out there who's got a family member, I talked with a priest friend about this. He said he thinks there's a very particular unique suffering that people who have a chronic or terminal illness go through. So watching my mother suffer through cancer for years, I got to see her give that over to Jesus, who she loved above everything else. And so then at the end of her suffering, when it was complete, she got to, you know, go home and get that reward and hear, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." And the last thing she said to all of us was, you know, "I'm going home to Jesus." And it was just really cool. You know, it wasn't great. It's not fun to lose a parent, especially when you're close to, but it could have been so much worse. My mother showed who Jesus was by uniting what she was going through to the suffering of Jesus. So bottom line, Mary perfectly communicates to us this gospel of suffering, the good news of suffering. And the good news of suffering for a Christian person is that we don't suffer the way other people do, or at least we shouldn't, because there's meaning to our suffering. We have an opportunity to enter into suffering with other people and to be there and to exhibit compassion. We have the chance to feel our feelings deeply, but then offer them back to meet the thirst of Jesus Christ. And we get to, in that offering back, discover a deeper union with Jesus in his sacred heart. So bottom line for tonight, Mary shows us how to carry crosses, other people's, Jesus's, and ultimately our own. So with that, sorry, that was a long talk. Obviously, that's one that means a lot, because there's a lot of great people within that I love and care for a lot, that I just shared about. We're going to kick off the Instagram. I'm going to unmute everyone, and then I'm going to take us off of the YouTube rant.